So glad to have you with us for what's going to be a stimulating hour of discussion, and I hope you have some questions to put to our panelists after we hear from them and after we have a discussion just following their comments. Thanks to those of you, I'm looking around for the cameras, who are joining us online as well. We're going to be talking today about how the way that we work and live while we work, or maybe should, shift how we think about city building and city planning, and how we design our cities and our spaces and our communities. Places have been planned for a very long time, for over a century, based on the 9-to-5 model, where we mostly hop in our vehicles or on transit to get to our work, but we know that's changed dramatically in the last couple of years, but has been shifting in the last decade or so too. In their presentations, the speakers in our panel are going to share some of their stories and reflections, including their experiences with remote work, whether doing it themselves or running companies that involve remote work and employees. And we'll be asking some questions, ideas and themes to explore, including how increasing the ability to work virtually anywhere has affected our communities and the ways that we interact with each other. Most of us have had some of that experience in the last while with that, for better and for worse. What does the way that the places we work are changing mean for future infrastructure investments in energy efficiency and public health? With more people being able to work from home, what happens to our casual conversations and the creativity that happens when we spontaneously run into each other in our workspaces or maybe on the way to and from? What does it mean for innovation? And what about housing? What are the opportunities for some of those vacant office spaces and other workspaces? We've heard too about the differential impact the pandemic's had on different demographics, from young people to the very young, to teenagers, to seniors, and what to do when you don't live near a green space and have the ability to exercise or explore in that way. The impact on working moms or those who have had to leave the workforce, the so-called she session in the last while. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and to the question and answer portion of the panel, and delving into some of these questions and opportunities with our speakers today. First, as I mentioned, we do have a brief presentation from each of our panelists. I'll tell you a little bit about them first before they begin. Houssam Elokda is the CEO of 100 Exponential and the Vice President of Citco Group, with global experience in lean design and manufacturing, public sector innovation, and technology. And he also has personal experience with the phenomena of living in cities that we don't work in. He's also a Liverpool fan, the football club, not the town, here in Nova Scotia. Nothing against Liverpool. So hoping that your team manages its way back to the top, Isaiah. Alexandra McCann's with us here too. She's the executive director of an organization for innovation-driven entrepreneurship. She hosts the On-Side podcast and has also worked remotely. Among her many accomplishments and interests, which you can find out more about online at the conference website, Alex is the co-founder of Sun Under the Sea Nutrition. It's a dairy-free creamer company based here in Nova Scotia. I had to ask her more about it just now because as a morning show host, I'm very interested in coffee. So yes, I Googled it as well to find out what's in this dairy-free creamer, and it turns out it's made of marine collagen and another oil called MCT, which is derived in this case from coconuts. She didn't bring any samples today, but I'm going to follow up. Houssam Elokda, is the managing principal of Happy Cities, who has a passion for creating urban plans, policies, and designs that boost human happiness. And isn't that what we all want? His passion has led him to roles that include board membership for organizations that work in real estate and transit advocacy and construction. And he's been part of housing projects that highlight the intersection of housing design and social connectedness. And Happy Cities is based in Vancouver, so we're lucky that weighing his options, Houssam and his family have come down on the side of the East Coast in terms of his home base, #East Coast Lifestyle. Each of our panelists is going to tell you more about the work that they do and their thoughts about the future of work where trends are leading us, where we should be thinking about, and what we should be thinking about in terms of creating policy that guides that evolution, and how our relationships to our colleagues and community is changing here in Nova Scotia, where we may be living while we work or not. So let's begin with Isaiah Olateru. He's going to speak first, followed by Alex, and then by Houssam. Keeping in mind we have 20 minutes at the end of this presentation for your questions to the panel. Please welcome Isaiah.
Thank you so very much, Portia, and I'm excited to be in the midst of several city builders. They say to accomplish something great, you've got to do it together. And I think that's the core theme as I think of how do we build cities. Now, it's a beautiful day outside, and maybe we should go on a little journey. So, quick question for you. What do you do when it's nice outside? What do you do when it's nice outside?
I run, I bike, kids swimming, it's that season.
Okay.
Skating on the 2 days it's available.
Patios, and maybe you take a walk. So, picture yourself for a moment on a very beautiful day, maybe here in Halifax or wherever you are. It's a Saturday, the sun is out, the weather is just perfect. You know, as you walk through the city and you walk through, say, downtown Halifax, you negotiate a turn, and then suddenly something changes. You know, you sense a bit of chaos. Things feel just a bit hot. Something is different. And then you just look up, and there's an apartment complex in flames. First surprise. Secondly, there's a 4-year-old toddler hanging up. What will you do? If you put yourself in that moment in time, I'll give you about 10 seconds to answer this question for yourself. What will you do? Do you call 911? Will you scream in horror? Or, you know, will you be silent in shock? So I took you through this journey because this actually happened in real life. And as I explain this, you may be connecting the dots already. That sometime in 2018, specifically on May 26, 2018, in Paris, France, this played out. And then what happened in France? Well, as this guy was walking, he looked up, apartment in flames. What did he do? A guy named Mamadou Gassama climbed up 4 stories and grabbed this baby and climbed back down. Had he not taken that action, you know, the outcome for that 4-year-old toddler would have been different. He broke the rules. What then happened to Mamadou? Mamadou was given one of the highest awards in France and granted instantaneous citizenship. The reason for that is, you know what? It took what I call an outlier action, an action that went against the grain. What grain? Well, if you've been to Paris, and you can also relate in our cities, you know, when there is chaos or when there is emergency, the cities are designed a certain way, and they're conditioned for a certain kind of response. We've got fire hydrants, we've got 911. But Mamadou was different. And you can begin to think about where I'm going with this. Mamadou was from Mali. Yeah, he was a Malian immigrant. His default adaptive response was not informed by Paris as a city. It was informed by Bamako, Mali. You don't have 911, barely have fire hydrants, and his environment had conditioned him to take action when there is chaos, and he did. So what happens when we're inserted in cities we're not from, and we have to do our job? That's Mamadou. So I'm going to bring it back home here. And as Portia said, I serve in the financial technology industry. We have offices in over 50 countries. That's an opportunity. That's a challenge. For me, on my team, the market closes at 4 p.m. Eastern Time, 5 in Halifax. One of our biggest challenges is how do we ask, or should we even ask employees in Pune, India, which is where we have, we'll say, the second largest workforce now, to wait in the office till 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., which is 5 p.m. here, or even 3 a.m. So it has created a challenge that we have to solve from a business perspective. How are we solving it? We're solving it the traditional way. So we're trying to sometimes work here in North America early in the morning, or sometimes really plead and negotiate and compensate our employees that do not want to work those hours to stay sometimes. If you've been to India, and if you're a woman, there's an extra risk. So we have to organize transportation and bus them back home late at night, provide food, provide compensation. But as a leader, I don't see that as a sustainable solution. So the default response of employees in Pune, my team in Pune, is they don't want to be out at night. How can we solve that problem? I would say that's a question for all of us, because if we're going to solve problems together, we've got to leverage the wisdom of the crowd. So maybe you'll have an answer for me, and I'll be willing to hear, or maybe when we get to the garden later on, something sparks. But one of my employees in November of 2021 asked, Isaiah, can I go walk in Goa? I've never been to Goa. Goa is on the west coast of India. It's a beach town. So I'm like, you know what? We're not in the office. Go walk in Goa. And a few others followed suit. Then something happened. Employees walking out of Goa want to walk at night. Anyone wonder why? It's hot, it's a beach town, and I did not know this. I've been to India, I've never been to Goa. Goa has the most vibrant night activity in all of India. So I'm going to go back to the business problem I defined earlier on. How do you incentivize, and how do you solve a problem where there's a time mismatch between North America teams and the teams in India, and it's hard to incentivize, and almost unfair to incentivize people to work late? Therein lies the power of the environments we dwell in, how the cities are designed, how nature sets the context and drives different behaviors. So I'm a learner in this school of designing cities and how cities can solve problems very creatively. From my own personal experience, I know time is counting down. I had the pleasure of working in Mexico City earlier this year, and most of my team, in India, North America, some in Dublin. How do I solve the personal problem of wanting to become more fit? And I think this question, the answer is pretty obvious to a lot of urban city designers as I talk to them. So my default way of getting to work here in Halifax is to hop in my car and then drive to work. 9 minutes, I'm in the garage here. and I get to my office. In Mexico City, I had to adjust my routine, adjust my timing. I didn't have a car. So how do I get to walking 20 steps a day? I can either listen to a motivational podcast, try to listen to my doctor or my friends, or move to a different city without even thinking about walking 20 steps a day. And that becomes the incidental outcome. I'm going to bottom line this. The theme here is the future of work and living in cities we don't work in. And I continue to ponder personally when I think of Mamadou and his background and how Bamako shaped his response and the interaction between how he reacts versus how the environment that he's inserted in challenges his own reaction. And also for my colleague that moved from Pune to Goa, and how we went from trying to selling a solution to, hey, I want to walk this exact hours. I'd rather be on the beach in the daytime. It's pretty lively at night. It's actually, that works for me. And how that environment, in turn, is impacting how he's responding to work options. And for me, how being curious and being given the opportunity to be curious and, just going to work out of Mexico City without setting the goal to hit my fitness goal, that becomes an incidental outcome. So for you urban designers and for all of us here being in here, like we're going to build cities together, what can we draw from these realities in being as creative as we can, in using how we think of cities, our environment, in solving the most massive problem we've got to face, which is climate change. So I have hope. Someone posed the question earlier on, why should we be optimistic? I am optimistic because I think we have an opportunity to see out of the box. And the path to that is experimenting across cities. And that is what happens when we live in cities we don't work in. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Isaiah. So we're going to have each speaker come up to the podium first, and then everyone's going to sit on the chairs for the discussion and the Q&A. So next up, we have Alex.
Okay, hi everybody. Thanks so much for having me here today. I'm really excited to be in person. I've made it a personal commitment over the last 2 months to try to get out in person and see people and enjoy being together. And our theme today is talking about the future of work, and I'm here to do that. And before I jump in, I'm going to share a little bit about my organization, Onside. I'm the executive director there. And we like to think of ourselves as a community accelerator. We're a backbone, not-for-profit organization, and we're a community accelerator that's working with underrepresented groups and rural communities to foster something we call inclusive, innovation-driven entrepreneurship. And we do that in a couple of different ways. One of the frameworks that we use is collective impact, which is a way to draw different stakeholders together to solve very complicated problems, such as creating cities. And it's a really great way to bring people together and try to tackle complex and difficult issues. I'm going to tell you a little bit about Onside. I'm not going to spend too much time talking about Onside, but I do think that it's important because it'll help to make sense of some of the comments that I'm going to share and raise with you a little bit later. As an organization, we're focused particularly on fostering inclusive, innovation-driven entrepreneurship or innovation-based entrepreneurship. And we're doing this because we believe that this kind of entrepreneurship draws in resources, skills, talent, and has a multiplier effect in creating jobs and workforces that are dynamic and can really provide a prosperous and inclusive society. It doesn't solve every kind of problem that is out there. It is just one tool in the toolbox that allows for a prosperous and dynamic society. And some of the things that we're concerned about and that we've been working on, which we have lots of things, but I'll just touch on a couple of them. One of the things that we're particularly focused on is looking at indicators around inclusion. So we've launched an inclusive innovation monitor. You can go to our website. You can find that. If you don't have time to read about a 30-page document, you can just go to the website and do a quick dive and look at the cheat sheet of indicators that are there. But what we're looking at with our inclusive innovation monitor is the distribution of wealth, where people are in the geography here in Nova Scotia in particular, who is participating in an innovative economy, what are the jobs that are available to people, who is receiving the benefits and good outcomes from participating in this kind of economy. The other thing that we've also been focused on, in particular, we ran a project with MIT called REAP, the Regional Entrepreneur Acceleration Program, with rural communities across Nova Scotia, looking at ways to help them understand and foster this kind of innovative economy in their local and regional areas. How can we share the benefits of all the great things we have in these great cities like Halifax and share them with others across the province? The other thing we're really concerned about as well, as we're thinking about how we build our economy and inclusion, is also around building community. We launched a podcast. I encourage you to listen to it. And it's really around sharing the stories of entrepreneurs across our region who are focused on this kind of work. We also have some work. I actually thought I was going to speak on another panel that was about art and those kinds of things. We've also been very interested in the nature of placemaking, how art and the visualization of innovative and entrepreneurial spaces has an impact and is in a way as a driver for everyday citizens to participate in understanding what an inclusive and innovative economy looks like, feels like, is connected to. And so if you are downtown and you're in Halifax, you're at Volta, which is on Salter Street. On the side of the building there, you'll see this amazing mural that we helped to work on with a few of our partners, because making spaces accessible and inclusive and representing what an innovative economy looks like is really important for us all to see those economic benefits and outcomes that we want to see. So those are just a few of the things that we've been focused on at Onside. We have lots of other things we do. We do capacity building around investment and all kinds of great stuff. You can learn more about that on our website. These are some of the partners that we work with. So lots of great and exciting folks all across our region. And now on to the topic at hand, the future of work. This is a topic that's been very interesting to, I think, all of us, and we've all been experiencing some of the upheaval over the last 2 years at least, if not more than that. And I wanted to share a few observations from my perspective as someone who's looking at trying to build an innovative and inclusive economy and society, and how that shows up in cities and the places and spaces that are around us. So I'll share a few things that we have been observing. A couple of them are around the demographics. We know that Canada's population has been growing at an exponential rate. We have the highest or the fastest rate of growth in the G7. Our population is close to 37 million, and we're doing great in that area. 34% of all Canadians by the year 2036 are expected to be visible minorities, not including Indigenous folks. In Halifax, probably about 12% of the population is a visible minority. And recently we understood that Chinese is the third most spoken language that's here in Halifax. And this has been really great because it means that we have a very vibrant and dynamic community that's here. And although the pandemic was difficult for us, it also provided us with some opportunities. I'm sure many of you saw the promotions of working remotely come to Nova Scotia. We were doing great with our pandemic response. And so we've had many people move to Nova Scotia. And in fact, not everyone has moved to Halifax, as lovely as it is here, But our rural communities have actually been growing at 3 times the average rate in Canada. And so more and more people are moving to Halifax, but more and more people are actually moving to rural communities. And with the goal of doubling our population, Halifax as a rural or a regional municipality has both urban and rural areas that we really need to pay attention to and to think about, especially as we continue to grow our infrastructure and our sense of community. And the other thing that we're observing is that there's a lot of disruption kind of in our economy and the way that people work. The kinds of jobs that people are going into, the kinds of jobs that people are leaving. We have different sectors that are accelerating, different industries that are in decline. So for example, I think we all kind of know healthcare. You're kind of winning if you're in the healthcare sector. So 19% of folks are in occupations that are going to grow. So healthcare, graphic design, nurses, these kinds of services are on the upswing. If you're in manufacturing, if you're in agriculture, if you're in fishing, and some of these other traditional industries, your kinds of jobs are on the decline. And we've also seen that here in our region, our population, we have an older demographic, and it's really important for us to kind of shift through what does it mean to be at work. During the pandemic, 40% of people worked from home. That's a lot. Not everybody, but 40%. And now about 17% are working from home as we kind of move into this next phase, which is not as much, but it is still more than the 5% that we used to see. We're also seeing a lot of turnover. In August, about 12% of employees were thinking about leaving their jobs in the next 12 months. So that is like a huge amount of turnover that is happening. And that's just since January, because in January it was 6% and now it's 12%. So there's just a lot of disruption in the work environment. And how does all of this make us feel? We spend a lot of time at work, whether you're working at home or you're working in the office. 30% of your work life, or your life really, is spent at work. If you're a tech worker, you probably spend even more time. But how is this making us feel? We know there's a lot of disruption, so a lot of people are, starting new businesses. I was talking about my side hustle over here. But although we have all these wonderful tools, our ability to connect and to share, we're having higher rates of mental health struggles. We have tools. We've never been as connected, but disconnected at the same time. So this is something that's really important, and this is the thing that I'm thinking about. One of the things that I'm really thinking about as we're talking about the art of city building and the nature of the future of work is how do we build communities in a distributed environment, whether that's online or if you live in a rural area or other places. As I said, we've never been more connected, through the tools and technologies that we have. But why should I go to work? Why should I go to the places and spaces that we've created? What does the built environment offer me when I can just as easily stay at home with my dog and have my tea and be very comfortable with my blankets and everything else? Like, why should I go someplace? Why should I come here? Why should I go to my office, which is at Volta, which I do go to, but it's a bit of a struggle, I'm not gonna lie. And that's another thing, is thinking about why do we want to go there? What do we get? So I really want us to think about what value do we create in our built environment as we're looking towards the future. What is necessary to create that sense of community, which is ever so necessary? The other thing that's really important to me, and I'm thinking about quite a lot, as I mentioned some of the demographic information, is how do we connect our rural communities, which are growing and connected to Halifax, as well as the BIPOC communities and women. If you live in North Preston and you want to come to a tech event or do something downtown, it is really hard. The infrastructure that you need, the transportation, prevents you from accessing the opportunities and the spaces and the places that will be beneficial to your work, to the way that you want to live, and your opportunities for growth. And so it's really important for us to think about how do we bring these spaces and places together? How do we make them inclusive and welcoming? I know for myself, I work at Volta. It's okay. It definitely needs a little bit more of a concerned space about how to make that connected. And then the final thing that I'm thinking about as we're looking to the future and the nature of work is what is the infrastructure that we need for the future? Obviously, the tools, whether it's Zoom or other kinds of things like that, Mural or all the different things. In addition to the roads and the physical built environment that we need, what are the other things that we're going to draw us in to think about how we connect to our city, how we're able to work, how we're able to create a dynamic environment? And so as I leave you, because I'm running out of time and I would love to chat with you a bit more, but I wanted to share the things that are on my mind as we go into the panel, I would leave that with you of thinking about how do we create that connection and community, which is so desperately needed as we look at the nature of work and where we spend our time, because we spend a lot of time at work. So thank you very much.
I'm really honored to be here with you all. My name is Houssam Elokda. I'm honored to be here speaking from the unceded territory of the Magi people, Jipuktuk, and I'm honored to be sharing with you this conversation about the future of work, about the future of our cities, and how it's all connected to the concept of happier, healthier, and more inclusive communities. In 2018, our organization, Happy Cities, was invited to the city of Rotterdam to help them implement a network of parklets across their neighborhood, like these small wooden ones over there. See, the city staff, they were concerned that walking rates in this neighborhood called Bloominghof were lower than most other communities. They didn't really know why, so they thought, well, a network of parklets, some improvement in urban design could be the solution, right? Surely design is our way out of this. We wanted to investigate that hypothesis a little bit more. So we asked them to do a little bit more embedded engagement into the community to try and understand, and we did that by spending some time in the community. So we actually worked out of a local office for a couple of weeks, worked out of community centers, just to get the rhythm of the community because we were not from Rotterdam. We started talking to people on the street, having these casual conversations, and we connected with community champions, people like Mohammed here in this picture, who is connected to everyone else in the community, and things kind of kept snowballing from there as we kept learning and learning. Another thing we wanted to do is to give some value to the residents so that we're not just asking them for value, asking them for information. So what we did was we hired a photographer, and we asked him to give free photography lessons to the kids, the young people in the neighborhood. So he kind of took them out on a tour, asked them to go to their favorite spots so that they can take some professional portraits taken of them. From our perspective, we wanted to see what places the kids will choose. We wanted to see where they were going to take us. We wanted an excuse to hang out with the kids and ask them questions about their neighborhoods for a few hours, and they got some pretty sick portraits out of it, and they got to learn how to take these pictures themselves. And what we learned from them, what we learned from other people that we spoke to in the community, that walkable design wasn't really the problem in Bloomhof. See, Bloomhof, like pretty much every other Dutch community, is pretty damn walkable. It's got density, there's no single-family home in sight. It's got mixed use, it's close to transit, it's connected to a wonderful cycling network. It's got playgrounds, community gardens, sports facilities, schools, you name it. So what was the problem? This picture kind of starts to show you a little bit of what's going on here. You can see here, it's a wonderful apartment building, but all the windows are shuttered. I bet the Dutch designer who designed this building can't for the life of them understand why that was happening. And it's not just happening in this building, it was happening all across Bloomhof. See, Bloomhof is a predominantly immigrant community. It's a predominantly low-income community. About 75% of the people there are either from North Africa, from Turkey, from predominantly Muslim populations. When I saw that, I immediately knew why. because I am Egyptian, I'm from North Africa, I am Muslim, and in Muslim culture, visual privacy is valued in a way that it just isn't in Dutch culture. So we started seeing these connections throughout Bloemhof. It's not the absence of walkable design, but how walkable design manifested to meet the unique needs of this community. And so design, more design, wasn't going to be their way out. So we had to change the approach of the entire project with our clients. And what we did was basically rejig it to help them build an engagement approach and build relationships with the community. So we brought them all together, helped them build this trust, helped them build this understanding so they can do it again in Bloemhof and in other communities. I was really proud of that work. You know, there goes our team, the Canadians, coming to the Netherlands, the masters of urban design, and telling them how to do things better. And then I went home. And I was visiting my in-laws in what you can all imagine is the typical car-dependent North American suburb. And I realized that there are a lot of the basics that we aren't doing well here. See, Bloemhof, even though it was rated the 4th most problematic neighborhood in all of the Netherlands, probably does better in meeting equity outcomes, in meeting health outcomes, resilience, inclusivity, whatever you name it, than most North American suburbs. It helped me understand that walkability is the foundation from which all of the goals that we want to achieve in our city can be addressed. Whether it's the social city, the resilient city, the healthy city, the inclusive city, and yes, the happy city, which tries to balance all of these ideas with a focus on how people feel and subjective well-being. Walkability is the foundation that carries all of this together. Without it, it's difficult for us to help address these goals. Without it, everything crumbles. And when we're talking about the future of work, it's really important to understand how companies have been making decisions in the last 10 years. This is a study in 2015. They tracked 500 companies that were going across had recently moved, and they found that they're moving to places that are more walkable, better connected with transit, better connected with cycling infrastructure. And the #1 cited reason is to attract and retain talent, because they recognize that this is increasingly what young people are trying to do. This is where they're trying to live. So walkability is the way that we can address some of these challenges. And that should be good news, right? It should be good news because walkability is probably the most heavily researched topic in urban planning. We know what it is, we know how to measure it, we have mountains of evidence to support its benefits. But for some reason, the most recent study looked at population growth in Canada, found that 73% of population growth has been happening in car-dependent suburbs. And the vast majority of new communities being built, not existing, of new communities being built in Canada are car-dependent communities, not walkable communities. So why is that happening? I was going to shout for the group. So why is that happening? Why aren't we building walkable communities? That's a really important question to ask, and it's a question that we've been asking at Happy Cities for quite some time now. Change the mic? Okay, thank you. Good? Hello? Okay. It's a question that we've been asking for quite some time at Happy Cities now, because we can build really complex things in this country. We can build beautiful libraries, we can build highways, dams, power grids, hospitals with a level of consistency and a failure rate that is next to zero. But for some reason, we are failing in building walkable communities. We're failing at drastic levels. We think that's happening for a few key reasons, and I'm going to share them quickly with you because I don't have that much time. What we found in a lot of our research, and a lot of this research is led by my good colleague here, Tristan Cleveland, I don't know where he is, that we're finding there's a systemic bias against walkability in almost all North American cities. When we say systemic, we really mean policy and process. Here's an example. This is a site I'm working on right now. This site is in an area that the regional plan designates as an urban center. It's on a frequent transit corridor, which means the bus comes every 15 minutes. And it's next to 4 schools. It's an infill site, so within an established community. And it's next to a major park. It's really the ideal site for a walkable community. And what we proposed on this site is exactly what we identify as a walkable community, what research identifies as a walkable community, which is a place with various housing typologies, with public space, with local commercial, so that people have somewhere to walk to. But we are working against a lot to make that happen, to make that a reality. We are working against policies that are clearly biased towards car dependency. The municipal planning strategy of the area has policies that are kind of ridiculous. Like, one of them says that council has to achieve 70% single-family ratio in the plan area versus any other type of housing. There's clear bias against 2-unit dwellings and concerns with the impact of 2-unit dwellings on primarily single-unit dwellings, as if there's some kind of different kind of evil people who live in 2-unit dwellings. There's the same bias that you see on apartment buildings with limits. Only 12 units can happen in an apartment building. This is policy bias. And this is just one MPS. There are many others across the city, and there are many other layers of policy that have the same bias. This policy was made in 1992. Maybe it reflected some of the concerns of the community 30 years ago, but now no longer today. But today, even if the city planners don't want it, even if the consultant, the developer, even if everyone doesn't want it, we have to respond to it. And the process of reversing it is excruciating. Talk about a rezoning process, 2 to 3 years. Talk about an MPS amendment, 3 to 5 years. Development agreement, which should be the easiest of them all, is at least 2 years. Traffic impact statements, parking studies, infrastructure studies, sewer studies, all to prove that the walkable community that you want to build is not going to ruin the rest of the neighborhood. But car dependency does not demand the same process. When we think about the standards that we have to meet, it's always easier to build car dependency than to build walkability, and this didn't happen by accident. If you look at, in the early 1900s, the growth of people taking up cars, which was very exponential in the first 20 years, but actually in some point in the mid-1920s, it sort of flatlined a little bit, and car manufacturers were freaking out because they wanted to understand what was happening, and the reason they came up with is that cars didn't have enough space. There wasn't enough space in roads for cities, so they really thought to change that. They helped fund and found a research institute in Harvard University called the Bureau for Street Traffic Research, and this institute was dedicated to graduating engineers who are focused on solving problems that faced car traffic. Engineers that were focused on pushing solutions for the automotive industry solutions for solving car traffic, which is to build more roads. And with the help of the auto industry, this became the established and the most leading authority on traffic in North America. And the standards that came out of this institute, they can be traced to almost all North American cities today. Planners are not innocent of this either. If you want to know the history of low-density zoning, the history of single-family zoning, and why it seems to only be a phenomenon in North America, I implore you to Google redlining when you go home today. So the standards that we're working on were no accident. The bias that we're working on was no accident. And so long as any developer finds that walkability is the hard path, is the expensive path, is the uncertain path, they will always be tempted to choose car dependency. This is the system that leads you to fail consistently on developing walkability. The good news is, if that bias was built against walkability, then perhaps we can restructure that bias to make it for walkability. If the standards make it easier to build car dependency, then maybe we can have a parallel standard for walkability for when the community chooses to build walkability. And the example I shared in the beginning, like Bloominghoff, has to remind us that walkability is only the beginning. And after that, we have to tailor it to the needs of the community. And I think we need to act on this, and we need to act on this with the urgency that the crises we are facing now demand. Thank you. Sorry for going a little over.
Thanks. So we've been given lots to think about in the short time you each had, but a little bit more time to expand on some of the themes that have come up around connectedness to work, whether you're working with international companies, whether you're in rural Nova Scotia, or whether you're in a rural part of HRM, or whether you're in a community outside of HRM that may yet to be built, or in Amsterdam. A question first to all of you is around community connection in a changing work environment and ways to foster a feeling among people that you work with that you are connected and working as a team, because that comes up often around remote work, is are we becoming more alienated from each other, whether you're working in Goa and connecting with employees who are here in Halifax, or whether you're in Digby and trying to speak with colleagues in a more urban area. And so I'll put that to you first, Isaiah. How do you bridge some of those gaps in a remote work environment, and how have you been doing that, since it is a challenge for leaders, whether that's the built environment you're working with or the culture of your organization?
Okay, I'm going to start by saying I don't think I have the perfect answer to this. And, you know, we've been presented with incidental experiments that's been absolutely amazing. So from a personal perspective, I'm still in the process of landing on what I think the optimal answer is. And I've, vacillated between, remote work, but how do we design in togetherness into work? Because I see studies about people that work remotely are lonely. And I see studies that, if people can't work remotely, there's, and then we have the example I gave you about, Garang in Goa, and how that just magically solved a business problem that, we were thinking about solving it traditionally. And maybe there's a solution think of a different city. Where I stand now, really, and it could change. I'm a big fan of Adam Grant, and he's got this podcast. He's an organizational psychologist, and he does emphasize that whatever we do in organizations, we need to try to answer the question: how do we keep people physically together somehow? Walking from Mexico City, I walked from a workstation, and so there are businesses springing up where you have I don't know what the name. It's not called workstation. Working groups. They have facilities that you can go collaborate with people. So I think that's a solution. But whatever solution we land on, I think it is critical to encourage people to gather at least a few times, and I think that's a critical ingredient of the future of work. And if we are to understand each other better as human beings, and we had to live in a more inclusive society, workability is a dimension of bringing people together. And we need to optimize bringing people together, whether office, whether streets, whether it's designing. Those collisions need to happen. For me to understand you better, I need to engage with you. I need to not be happy when you put stuff in the microwave and walk through that in the office and walk through, why did this gentleman put his food in the microwave? And how do we walk through that interaction and that understanding? And what options do I have in making sure that that issue is resolved in a human way and in a way that I get to understand you better and we build a better world? So I've changed the question for myself. How do we optimize flexibility, fairness, and togetherness across those three pillars? And so if you have a better answer, I'll be willing to listen to it. So
It all comes down to that universal issue of the microwave. I appreciate your symbol.
I stole that from Adam Grant, by the way, so I got to give credit. Yeah.
And what about in the work that you've been doing, Alex, as far as creating spaces for community connection, whether they're in the city or rural Nova Scotia?
Yeah, I think that how we connect is really important, and I think that over the last 2 years in particular, the way in which we work, at least in my office, has changed substantially. How we connect to our projects that I mentioned to, and how we work kind of together. And I think that where we've sort of landed is that we're sort of restructuring the way in which we utilize time in order to connect in a meaningful way. I think I might have mentioned, you can kind of do work, be on your computer, read a document kind of from anywhere. And in our office, we try to come into work 2-3 times a week. At first we were coming in, but then we'd be on Zooms with other people, and I was like, well, what's the point of all of us being together if we're not actually gonna do anything useful that's like bringing us together? So we've kind of restructured our time. So when we're kind of in the office or in a physical space together, we're trying to connect, share ideas, have those collisions, and those kinds of things. And then the work, I guess, as it were, the non-human connection work, you can do that back at home. And then the other thing that I was kind of talking about as well is that we have a lot of places across Nova Scotia, across, everywhere, where people are still looking for that connection. So if you're in a rural community, you're not downtown Halifax, you can't get to a tech accelerator, this awesome library with great Wi-Fi. How do you connect into that? And so we're seeing a lot of kind of co-working spaces that are sort of popping up where people can go and engage and gather there, where they can have collisions there, and then having those groups of folks be able to connect back and share ideas back here in Halifax or to bigger urban centers. But I think we're thinking about how we restructure our time together so we can build those human connections that argue about who left the popcorn in the microwave. And I think it's actually really important, especially for younger people coming into the workforce, who need to learn some of those communication skills and learn those connection skills. I feel like we're growing up in an environment now, and I sometimes even see it with young folks that I work with, where everyone's on their device or like scheduled in a very specific amount of time, and doesn't have those times and spaces for those softer skills, which are so important as we try to navigate complexity. So. Thinking about time and space and building connections across boundaries is something that I'm particularly interested and focused on.
Houssam, did you want to talk a little bit about community connection? I'm sure it may in part come back to walkability.
Well, yeah, obviously, and I think one of the things that we found in our research is that when it comes to well-being, social connections are the strongest predictor of human well-being. And we found that consistent across different cultures, age groups, income levels, whatever, you name it. This is one of the most kind of fundamental human laws. Good, positive social relationships make us happier and healthier on the long term. And for us, the kind of grounding principle of making that happen is trying to help people have repeated interactions with a limited number of people, which means maybe you're walking down the street and you see your neighbor for the first time. First time, maybe you'll introduce yourself, or maybe you'll even nod to each other. And as that gets repeated with the same person, not with new people, the likelihood that you build a friendship, that you build a relationship with that person keeps increasing. And the opposite of that, which is in big cities, where you see you're having too many interactions, but not with the same person over and over again, and so people actually feel alone in a crowd. Walkability, yes, is the foundation that you can do that, and big cities are pretty walkable. But the reason why mid-sized cities, smaller cities, tend to actually rate higher on happiness is because, you live in the same place for 30 years, there's only so many people, you're gonna meet almost everyone. I always say Halifax is the perfect middle ground because we've got a lot of reasons for people to go outside of their home, for people to be outside, but you're also just as likely to bump into a friend when you're walking down Spring Garden here than you are in almost any other city. So these kinds of things have to be intentional. Places like this, places to encourage people outside, designing front porches so that they're deep enough that people have a place to sit and call their own, but they're not too deep that they're so far away from the street that they have no connection to it. these kinds of nuances are what matters in creating strong social relationships in a community.
Is remote work, as it's rolling out now, is it moving in the direction it needs to as far as climate change goals go? I was just reading a study which showed that a lot of people, when they were working from home, they were taking fewer long trips to work, but they were taking more short trips within their neighborhoods. For example, well, I'm just going to run out and get coffee for the household, or I'm not commuting, I'm not at the office and bound to be in the office 9 to 5, so I'm going to take a whole bunch of shorter trips to get groceries, for example, shopping daily for ingredients, that sort of thing. Emails are very energy intensive, for example. You may not be recycling at home if you don't have the setup that you have at work at the same way. How intentional do we need to be around using this opportunity to work toward our climate change goals at the same time as we're shifting our work habits so substantially, Isaiah?
And I'll be transparent. My perspective came first from a business imperative, and I always encourage and try to make sure we're facilitating really, how can we solve this problem out of the box? And that's why I am personally optimistic. So if I define a problem, how do we cut the rate of CO2 emissions from automobiles over the next 20 years until we transition to something else? If someone would have told me that remote work will be the solution to that defined problem, probably 4 years ago, I probably would have tried to argue with them. But I think that's now becoming more of a viable solution. So in my response earlier, what's the trend and what's the optimal landing spot? And as I land on what I think is an optimal answer from at least my team, I still think it's going to be some sort of a mix that reduces motion outside of walking, which is healthy, and a mix that optimizes structured, semi-structured engagement, just based on what you said there, because I think that was very insightful. Running across people just by itself might not be where the magic is. Meeting the same kind of people to a certain extent might be where the magic is. So that's why I say, solving critical problems fits that inverted U curve. It's good until it's not good. So where is that turning point? And I think that U curve type structure is probably kind of the answer to the question of, the balance between remote and in-person, the balance between many and few, the balance between walking and other forms of transportation, and so on and so forth. So, and I will continue to explore that construct. Yeah.
Sounds like there needs to be a real intentionality, though, in the setup and evolving over time and depending on what line of work that you're in.
Correct, because there's one end of the spectrum. If you're a doctor or a nurse, you don't have as many options right now. If you're working in, IT or call center, you do have more of that option. So, and I saw a statistic about a month ago that 50% of jobs cannot really be remote. So the opportunity is the other 50% that can either be fully remote or some sort of a hybrid. And how do we explore that 50%? And how do we also design in fairness to it? To where some people are not more advantaged than the others. So.
Thanks, Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
Alex, did you want to address that? Or I'm also curious about those people who get left behind, who don't have the option of remote work, but I can circle back to that.
I guess I'll try to be quick. So I definitely think remote work is amazing and gives lots of people different options and can connect people, across great distances and in a way that we weren't really exploiting before. We've had a lot of these tools in the past; they just weren't exploited or used on a very aggressive basis. So it's great to see that. If you're in a place where you don't have good internet, hard to do. I definitely know that my rate of using fossil fuels for my car, is definitely lower. I'm spending less on clothes and, all these other kinds of things. One thing that popped into my head that when you're talking about climate change and these kinds of things, I'm curious about, I don't actually know the answer to this. So I do think there's an opportunity to, reduce road traffic and use of fuels and things like that. On the flip side, servers for computers and things like that use up a lot of energy. Like those big data storage facilities, which I'm assuming that we're having more and more and more of those, they use up a ton of energy and water and all these kinds of things to cool them. So I do think that as we kind of go forward into this brave new world of thinking of climate, all of our devices and things, and all of the metals and things that go into these things, I suspect that over time we may have a shift of where we're seeing climate impacts. From just the nature of things. So I think, less airplanes, less driving, like less of those kinds of things, but there could be a flip side that we need to take into account, and that's more on the use of energy in other areas.
Yeah, absolutely. Even just when everybody or a lot of people were sent home to work remotely, they came home with a work laptop. They might already have devices at home, many devices, and so there's a duplication and perhaps creation of more waste on that front. Because we didn't really have a plan. We just, we headed home and that was it.
Things to figure out.
Yeah. Houssam, what are your thoughts around that?
We obviously can't predict what remote work is going to do on the long term, but the things that we do know is that you can't really replace the value of face-to-face social interactions. It's very difficult to do that over remotely. You can probably be more productive working from home, but the value of face-to-face interactions in the work environment cannot be understated. That means that people who go to the office will always more likely to have stronger relationships with their peers, more likely to have access to more information and more work opportunities, which means there's always a risk for, if you're talking about some people are going to the office, some people are not going to the office, there's always a risk that people that are not going to the office feel left out or feel left behind. On the other hand, it opens up a lot of opportunities for people who weren't previously able to access offices, such as people with disabilities. Like, some people can't go to the office, and then that opens the opportunity to actually enter the workforce and have income and have a lot of things that previously weren't able to have. On a large scale, I think it's going to balance out at a hybrid, which seems to be where I think most people I'm talking to at least are doing. We have had a workforce that have been scattered from city to city since before the pandemic, and hybrid is where we landed. Even when I was living in Vancouver and our office is in Vancouver, I would go in there about half the time because there's benefits to both. The thing about cities is that they have always been shaped by how we get to work. When walking and horses were the predominant mode of transportation, cities were a certain shape. When the streetcar and the bicycle rolled in, they started growing in different ways. That's a community like the North End, how that community grew. And when the car became the dominant mode of transportation, the city was also shaped to match it. If people move differently, it's going to affect cities. We just don't know by how much that split is going to be. Is it going to be more interesting for people to live out in the middle of the forest because now they can work remotely? Maybe some people will do that. We don't know. We don't exactly know how many will opt for these decisions. So I think there will be a shift that, as always, planners and city builders have to respond to. But it's not going to get us out of the real problems that we're challenged with. It's not going to reduce the need for us to build robust transit systems, build good walkable communities, energy-efficient buildings, and all of these things that are absolutely essential for us to face the crises that we're facing today.
This is a good lead on. It's a question from our virtual audience, which is about gentrification, how we address gentrification that happens when people are moving to cities that they don't work in necessarily. The example here is Americans in Mexico City. That's a challenge that we'll probably be seeing more of here in Nova Scotia, whether it's in Halifax or in rural areas, especially as we get more internet connectivity. Anybody like to address that?
I just wanted to add on to that before you address it. And also, we are dangerously sitting between people and the lunch break. Somebody who was supposed to be on a panel today and wasn't able to be, Mia Swakanosho, I promised her that I was going to bring this up in the conversation about future of work, is that it's very slanted towards tech bro innovation, when what we're talking about in terms of work has actually always existed for anyone who doesn't work the 9 to 5. For long-haul truck drivers, for people who are working a 24-hour workday with shifts, and for people who are working in jobs that are not in the traditional work sector. So I promised her that I was going to introduce that into the conversation, is we tend to have the future of work conversation in a very stratified way, when there's all kinds of work, all kinds of barriers and opportunities for many different types of work that are not being considered in the conversation, in addition to what you said about gentrification. Flagging for people in the audience, because this is the panel that is between us and lunch. If there is one person whose hand shoots up, that will be the one question we will take. Otherwise, we'll welcome the panelists to answer the question around gentrification and the considerations for other types of work, and then that will be it. So if I see a hand up now, that's the one we'll take, but I'll pass it back to Portia and the panelists.
Thanks, Louise. All right, we do have a question in the audience. Who's looking a little hungry, to be fair?
Sorry.
So with the growth of remote work, obviously the ability to live and work more white-collar IT tech jobs in rural areas becomes an ability. And there's been online a lot of blogs and things of that nature of people from maybe Ontario or BC who have tech jobs that moved to Nova Scotia to have that great rural experience in Nova Scotia. And as was said, rural Nova Scotia is growing very quickly. But of course, providing any kind of services in rural areas is far more expensive than in urban areas. Whereas people who have jobs that you have to physically be present, doctors, nurses, they have to stay in these urban areas. So I'd wondered if you'd speak a little bit about how that can have a somewhat regressive effect on those who have to be present, which these jobs tend to be maybe less well compensated in urban areas and are reliant on transit and have to be physically present, as opposed to those who move to rural areas, overall cost much more to maintain the standards of living they have there, but are working much, remote jobs that are maybe a little more well compensated, creating sort of a regressive move of money back out of areas.
You've been looking somewhat into this area, Alex. Maybe you're best to start.
Yeah, sure. I'll answer as best I can. I concede I'm not an urban planner, so that's not my area of expertise. I will defer to my esteemed panelist here. But I do think that whether we like it or not, more and more people are moving to rural areas. And what I'm sort of observing, at least in the communities where I'm working, is that we're starting to see clustering or clumpings or growing of certain communities that have been able to figure out a way to create jobs, create access points, and I guess I would maybe call them nodes. I don't know if that's quite the right way to think of a city, a small growing city or village or hamlet. But I think that with certain groups of folks with access to employment and creating kind of co-working spaces or other kinds of spaces where people can gather, there's an opportunity to create some additional communities that have the potential to grow and other sort of semi-ex-urban kind of cores. And then what I'm thinking about is how do you connect those back? There is, I think you're talking about services, whether it's like road clearing or snow removal or, some of those kinds of things. And I know that there's been some work kind of at the provincial level and with the municipalities across the province to address kind of the number of ones that are there. That's a little bit beyond kind of my particular area of focus. But I do think that from a broad planning perspective, I think increasing access to transportation and some services to some of those areas, and then developing some of these hubs of activity around either remote work or co-work or things like that, can help that kind of transition. Because if we're going to double the population, I mean, Halifax is going to be extremely dense, and even our areas that are not far away, if you're an hour away, you're down on the South Shore, those communities there are already kind of developing and thriving, and you're having all kinds of other jobs down to the valley and beyond. So we're already at a point where there's an outward spread of connectivity, and I think there's some opportunities to make it better, to make it more effective and more efficient, and it needs to be thought about. I'm not the expert to think about those things, but I do think there's an opportunity there, because it's the trends are pushing us there, whether we want to go there or not. But.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think it depends on what you mean by rural communities, as in like a community that's on the edge of Halifax, or a rural community like Bridgewater or Wolfville. I think it's important to remember that the lumping up rural communities with car dependency and low density is pretty much a North American phenomenon. Rural does not have to mean that it's not walkable. And small town feel does not mean that it has to be sprawled out. These are things that are not a given. In fact, small towns actually have an even bigger need to have a robust main street, a robust core. It doesn't need to be as dense as downtown Halifax, obviously, and it shouldn't, but it does need to meet the basic requirements of walkability. The problem is, and the reason why this keeps happening over and over, is because car dependency is subsidized. It's because municipalities don't account for the long-term cost of building car dependency. Today, I would say probably most car-dependent communities struggle to sustain themselves in terms of what they offer to how much it costs to maintain them. And that's a problem it's not a rural problem, it's not a small town problem, it's a problem that most North American municipalities are facing. And it, again, comes back to the concept of how do we build better new walkable communities, and how do we transform existing car-dependent communities to become more walkable. And both of these things are possible if we just do it.
Just do it. That sounds like a very good closing comment. So I will bring it back to our other panelists for a closing comment, seeing as we are almost at time as we have this conversation about the future of work and how we want to build our communities. Isaiah.
Yeah, just very quickly, so we go to lunch. I think this has also caused a lot of reflection from my perspective, and also appreciate the complexity of the problem and the opportunity in front of us. And that's why I'm thinking of it in that U-curve analogy, and your question is very relevant to that. Urban, rural, and what's the impact of, someone moving into a rural area? Is that good? And then where is that sweet spot where it's not good anymore, based on how you've defined good? And if we appreciate the complexity and know that even the right answer may only be right up to an extent, it comes down back to policy. Communities then need to define, what am I trying to optimize for? And I'm a big fan of making sure I define the problem I'm trying to solve. So from a business perspective, I said earlier on, there are three things we're trying to solve for. How can we optimize for flexibility? How can we optimize for fairness? How can we optimize for connection? The moment I define those three things, I know that I'm not trying to solve a work from home or work from office problem. I'm trying to solve a remote problem. And if you're remote and you can be connected, then that's good. Same with your situation here. Communities will need to really catch policy up to the opportunities and to the realities of our time and decide for themselves, what do they want to optimize for, and how should that reflect in policy, and then how should that reflect in how we redesign cities and really make this call. Do we want more people coming in, Do we have more Airbnbs versus less Airbnbs? So I personally had a rethink about Airbnbs when I went to Mexico. And whoever posed the question about Americans in Mexico City, I'll be looking forward to talking to you, or Canadians in Mexico City. A lot of lessons learned there. But it's complex, but it also offers an opportunity. And if we respect the complexity and define the problem well, I think that's where the opportunity lies. Thank you.
And Alex, finally to you.
What was the original question?
A closing comment as we talk about some thoughts to take forward into redesigning how we work and live.
Yeah, I think that for me, as I'm thinking about kind of where we go from here, as I said kind of during my presentation, the things that I'm most interested in or thinking about is how do we create connection, how do we create community, and how do we do that in a distributed environment, whether that's virtual, physical, or whatever, because I do think we have all of the tools, but the level of disconnection is at an all-time high, and we need to have that connection to be able to be productive in our work, productive in our life, productive in the development of relationships, whether that's on the small town Main Street or downtown here in Halifax. And so if we want to have vibrant, exciting, and interesting and dynamic communities, having them be connected and building community are the things. And so I'm really interested to see what the policy implications can be or should be, or the discussion around that can help to foster the environment that will allow that to happen.
Mm. And who are we asking about what we want to happen, which brings us back to Houssam and asking the community, what do the young people want? Where are you going? What are you interested in? And giving them something as you're asking them that question. Creativity around community consultation seems to be something we need to focus on more finally.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are a lot of really incredible, great things happening and changes that have been happening in Halifax. Changes in the way we've been building cities, but I think primarily changes in belief that we can actually create incredible things here in Nova Scotia, that we can come up with new innovations, with new projects that the rest of the world looks to. This sense of belief, I think, is really important when we're trying to address all these big problems, because it's really easy to look at them and think, well, why would we be the ones to do it, and not all these people in the big cities and doing all of that. But I totally have faith there is something special here. There's something special about this community, something special about this province. There's absolutely no reason that we can't meet all of these challenges and start addressing them and do things that the rest of the world looks to us to do. And when it comes to how we build cities, it's always going to be this balance between how do we build systems that incentivize good decisions, that incentivize better behavior, that incentivize better development, but also how do we create flexible systems? Not repeat the same mistakes of that 1992 bylaw that I mentioned, not pretend to think that we are going to be able to predict the needs of the future of these communities, but build flexibility so that the communities today and eventually planners' jobs becomes how to respond, how to change, how to adapt, how to grow. And listening, now I think we treat engagement as always transactional, always a one-time activity related to certain projects, when it needs to be a more continuous thing. Trust is never built over one interaction. It has to be built over multiple iterations. That's how you start building trust between government and people, between communities that come from different backgrounds, and between peoples of various backgrounds. And doing that is absolutely possible and is essential to building well-being, to achieving climate action, and facing all of these crises that we're facing.
Thank you. Thanks for the fascinating discussion. I appreciated you all being here. I say Olateru, Alexandra McCann, and Houssam Elokda. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Portia. Thank you.